What would you do if your family's darkest secrets were finally revealed? These chilling true stories will leave you speechless. Story 1. The baseball bat confrontation. Sometimes the people meant to protect us do the most harm. But what happens when someone decides they've had enough? My grandfather passed away unexpectedly from a heart attack when my dad was just a boy. It left my grandmother to raise her kids alone. Eventually, she met a man named Mitch, and for reasons no one could ever quite understand, she let him into her life. Mitch wasn't your typical stepfather, he was a parasite. Over the years, he manipulated his way into her finances, draining every penny until she was forced to file for bankruptcy not once, not twice, but 3 times. My dad and his siblings hated Mitch from the start, and their hatred only grew as Mitch's true nature revealed itself. He wasn't just a con artist, he was abusive. He ruled the house with an iron fist, terrorizing the children while my grandmother turned a blind eye. But then came the breaking point. My dad was 17, no longer a scared little boy. One night Mitch pushed too far. Fueled by years of pent-up rage, my dad grabbed a baseball bat and stormed through the house. Mitch, suddenly not so tough, ran like his life depended on it. He hid under a bed, cowering as my dad swung the bat and screamed for him to come out. Eventually, my grandmother came to her senses, or maybe she just realized she had nothing left to lose. She annulled the marriage and reverted to her first husband's last name, claiming military benefits meant for a man who'd been dead for years. Mitch disappeared from their lives, but the scars he left behind never did. Story 2. The Veteran's Nightmare. War doesn't end on the battlefield. For some, it comes home with them and destroys everything in its path. My grandfather was a Vietnam veteran, and for a long time he was something of a ghost in my family's history. He went missing in action for weeks during the war, and when he finally returned, he was a different man. No one ever talked about what happened during those weeks. Maybe they didn't know. Maybe they didn't want to know. But the man who came back wasn't the man who left. He drank heavily, his nights spent at the local bar until he passed out in a ditch. His children, my father included, would have to find him and drag him home. Then there were the nightmares. They'd hit him out of nowhere, sending him spiraling into confusion. One night, he woke up in a panic and started choking my grandmother, convinced he was back in the jungle, fighting for his life. My dad, just a kid at the time, watched it all unfold. That moment, more than any other, broke their family. Even as my dad grew older, he never forgave his father for the things he'd done. But deep down he also understood. The war broke my grandfather, and without the help he needed, he broke everyone else around him. Story 3. The Sabotaged Affair. What would you do to protect your family? And how far would you go for revenge? My mom's first husband was a violent alcoholic who tormented her and my older sisters for years. She finally escaped, running across the country to start over. That's when she met my dad. For a while everything seemed fine. But then came the affair. My mom knew about it, though she never said a word. For a year, my dad carried on with another woman, coming home late, lying to her face and pretending nothing was wrong. Then one day that woman got into a car accident. A terrible one. The brakes on her car had failed. She survived, barely, and my dad ended the affair after that. But years later my mom let something slip. We were reminiscing about the past when she casually said, "Maybe someone messed with her brakes," and then walked away. To this day, I don't know if she meant it as a joke or a confession. But knowing my mom, knowing what she went through in her first marriage, knowing how fiercely protective she became, I wouldn't put it past her. Story 4. The Woman Erased. Some secrets are buried so deeply they stay hidden for generations. But the truth always finds a way to the surface. My great-grandmother's name was Clara. At least that's what I learned later. For most of my life I didn't know she existed. Everyone in the family said she died in childbirth, but that wasn't the truth. Clara had suffered from what we now know as postpartum depression. But in 1928 they didn't have a name for it, let alone a treatment. Instead of helping her, my great-grandfather committed her to an asylum. She spent the next 50 years locked away, forgotten by her family. My grandmother and her sisters grew up believing their mother was dead. My great-grandfather kept it a secret, fearing the stigma would ruin his daughter's chances of getting married. He carried that lie to his grave and no one ever questioned it. Years later my grandfather, who married into the family, found out the truth. The guilt ate away at him until he finally told my mother. To this day no one else in the family knows. Clara's name has been erased from our history, but her story haunts me. Story 5. The Girl Nobody Wanted. Sometimes the ones who need love the most are the ones the world forgets. There was a girl at my school named Emily. She was needy, clingy, and always searching for someone to latch onto. Most people avoided her, but I tried to be kind, though even I kept my distance. Looking back, I wish I'd been better to her. Emily never seemed to go home. She stayed at school year-round, even during holidays. Then one day she got caught shoplifting during a trip to the mall. The school expelled her and she disappeared. Years later I learned the truth. When Emily was just a little girl, her toddler brother drowned in their pool. Her parents blamed her. From that moment on, they wanted nothing to do with her. She was shipped off to school, to camp, to anywhere but home. After her expulsion, her family brought her back to the US and had her committed to a psychiatric institution. She wasn't sick. She wasn't dangerous. She was just unwanted. Story 6. The Woman in the Woods. Some places don't want to be found. And some people shouldn't find them. The forest behind my grandparents' house had always been a source of wonder and fear for me. It stretched on for miles, thick with trees whose twisted branches seemed to reach for you like bony fingers. My cousins and I used to play out there during the day, daring each other to go deeper and deeper into the shadows. But once the sun started to set, we wouldn't go near it. There were too many stories. Everyone in town had heard of the woman in the woods. Depending on who you asked, she was either a vengeful spirit, a witch, or just a sad, broken soul who had died out there, alone and angry. My grandmother used to warn us not to stray too far from the house, saying, "There are things out there you don't want to see." Of course we didn't listen. I was 14 the summer we found her cabin. It was my cousin Lily who first spotted it. We'd been exploring the deeper part of the forest, trying to map out the old trails that had been swallowed by undergrowth. It was late afternoon, and the sun was filtering through the trees in golden shafts of light. "Look," Lily said, pointing through the trees. At first I didn't see it. Then as I squinted, I realized she was pointing at a roof, barely visible through the thick canopy. It was slanted and covered in moss, blending almost perfectly with the forest around it. We crept closer, our hearts racing with a mix of excitement and fear. The cabin was ancient, its wooden walls warped and blackened with age. The windows were broken, and the door hung slightly ajar, creaking softly in the breeze. "It looks abandoned," I whispered. "Maybe," Lily said, though she didn't sound convinced. The air around the cabin felt wrong. It was too quiet. The birds that had been chirping just moments before had gone silent, and even the wind seemed to hold its breath. Lily wanted to go inside, but I hesitated. Something about the place made my skin crawl. It wasn't just the eerie silence or the way the shadows seemed darker here, it was a feeling like we were being watched. "Come on," Lily urged. "Just for a second." Reluctantly, I followed her up the creaking steps and through the doorway. The interior was even worse than I'd imagined. The floor was covered in dirt and rotting leaves, and the walls were scrawled with strange symbols that looked like they'd been scratched into the wood with a knife. A single chair sat in the center of the room, facing the fireplace. And then there was the smell. It was faint but unmistakable, something foul and rotting like meat left out in the sun. "We should go," I said, my voice trembling. But Lily was already moving deeper into the cabin. She stopped in front of the fireplace and bent down to pick something up. "What is it?" I asked. She held it up, a necklace, delicate and silver, with a small locket hanging from it. "Leave it," I said. "Why?" she asked. "It's just a necklace." "It's not ours," I said. But she slipped it into her pocket anyway. That night the nightmare started. I dreamt of the forest, but it wasn't the same forest I knew. It was darker, the trees twisted and gnarled, their branches reaching for me like claws. And in the distance I saw her, the woman. She stood at the edge of the clearing, her back to me. Her hair was long and tangled, and her dress hung in tattered strips. I couldn't see her face, but I could feel her watching me. When I woke up, I was drenched in sweat, my heart pounding. I didn't tell Lily about the dream. I didn't want her to think I was scared. But over the next few days things started happening, small, unsettling things that made it harder to ignore. The first was the locket. Lily had left it on her nightstand, but the next morning it was gone. She swore she hadn't touched it and no one else in the house knew about it. We searched everywhere, but it was just gone. Then there were the sounds. At night, I started hearing faint whispers outside my window, too soft to make out the words but loud enough to wake me. When I'd look outside, there was nothing there, just the dark silhouette of the forest, silent and still. The worst came a week after we'd found the cabin. It was late, and I was sitting on the porch trying to shake off the unease that had been hanging over me like a shadow. The air was cool and the stars were out, but I couldn't relax. That's when I saw her. She was standing at the edge of the forest, barely visible in the moonlight. Her hair hung over her face and her arms were limp at her sides. I froze, unable to move or even breathe. She tilted her head as if studying me. And then, slowly she raised her hand and pointed, first at me and then at the woods. When I finally found the courage to look away and call for my dad, she was gone. The next morning Lily and I went back to the cabin. I didn't want to, but she insisted. She said we needed to return the locket even though it was gone. The cabin was exactly as we'd left it, but the feeling was worse. The air was heavier, the shadows deeper. Let's just leave, I begged. Lily didn't answer. She was staring at the fireplace. That's when I saw it, the locket, sitting on the mantel as if it had been waiting for us. Lily reached for it, but before she could touch it, the chair in the center of the room creaked. We both froze. Slowly, the chair began to turn, its legs scraping against the floor. And sitting in it was the woman. Her face was pale and hollow, her eyes sunken and empty. She opened her mouth, and the same foul stench we'd smelled before filled the room. Go, she rasped, her voice like dry leaves rustling in the wind. We ran. We didn't stop running until we were back at the house, our lungs burning and our hearts pounding. We never went back to the cabin. But sometimes late at night I still hear whispers outside my window. And I know she's still out there waiting. Story 7. The Clockmaker's Secret. Time doesn't heal all wounds. Sometimes it keeps them alive. There was a small shop in the middle of town that no one ever seemed to notice. Sandwiched between two towering brick buildings, its faded wooden sign read DeLacy's timepieces in peeling gold letters. I passed it every day on my way to work but never gave it a second thought, until the day the bell above the door chimed and I found myself standing inside. The shop smelled of dust and old wood, and the walls were lined with clocks of every shape and size. They ticked in perfect unison, a rhythmic heartbeat that filled the room. Behind the counter stood an old man with wiry gray hair and a pair of spectacles perched on his nose. Looking for something specific? He asked, his voice as steady as the ticking. I'm not sure, I said. He smiled. Sometimes it's the things we don't look for that find us. The clock caught my eye immediately. It was a small, intricately carved pocket watch, its gold casing etched with tiny stars and moons. The hands didn't move, frozen at exactly 11:11. How much for this one? I asked. The old man's smile faded. That one's not for sale, he said quickly, reaching to take it from my hand. Why not? It's broken. It's beautiful, I countered. He hesitated, his fingers twitching as though he wanted to snatch it away but couldn't bring himself to do it. Finally he sighed. Fine. But you must promise me one thing. Do not, under any circumstances, try to wind it. I laughed nervously. Why not? His eyes darkened. Some clocks keep more than time, he said. That night I couldn't stop thinking about the watch. I turned it over and over in my hands, tracing the delicate carvings with my fingers. Why had he been so adamant about not winding it? By midnight my curiosity got the better of me. I took a small key from the box it came in and inserted it into the tiny slot on the back. Slowly I turned it. Click. The hands began to move. At first, nothing seemed out of the ordinary. The watch ticked softly, its hands gliding around the face. But then the room grew colder. The shadows in the corners deepened, stretching across the walls like dark, grasping fingers. I heard whispers, faint and indistinct, like voices carried on the wind. And then the watch stopped. The next morning, everything was different. The streets outside my window were empty, the usual hustle and bustle replaced by an eerie stillness. The air felt heavy, thick with an unnatural silence. When I stepped outside I saw them. Figures frozen mid-stride, their faces locked in expressions of confusion and fear. A man on a bicycle, his wheels hovering just above the ground. A woman with her hand raised to her mouth as though she'd been about to scream. It was as though time itself had stopped. I looked down at the watch in my hand. The hands were still, pointing to 11:11. Desperate for answers I returned to the shop. The door was locked, the windows dark. I banged on the glass, shouting for the old man, but no one answered. And then I noticed something strange. The clocks in the window display were moving backward. The hands spun in reverse, faster and faster, until the numbers blurred together. And as they did, the world around me began to change. The buildings crumbled, their bricks disintegrating into dust. The streets cracked and splintered, vines and weeds pushing through the asphalt. The sky darkened, the sun shrinking to a pale, distant glow. And then I saw them, the shadows. They emerged from the cracks in the ground, their forms shifting and writhing like smoke. They had no faces, only gaping voids where eyes and mouths should have been. They were coming for me. I don't know how I made it back to my apartment. The shadows followed me, their whispers growing louder, more insistent. I could feel them pressing against the walls, clawing at the windows, trying to get in. The watch ticked softly in my hand, its sound the only thing keeping them at bay. And then I understood. The watch didn't just keep time, it controlled it. It was a door, a tether between worlds. And by winding it, I had opened something that was never meant to be opened. Now, I'm trapped in a world where time doesn't exist, haunted by shadows that never sleep. The watch sits on my desk, its hands frozen at 11:11. I don't dare wind it again. But I know it's only a matter of time before someone else does. The house that dreams. Some houses remember. Some houses dream. But this one hungers. The house had stood at the end of Ravenwood Lane for as long as anyone could remember. No one knew who built it or why it had been abandoned. Over the years, rumors grew like weeds, choking out reason and truth. People whispered about strange lights in the windows, voices carried on the wind, and the occasional scream in the dead of night. It became known as the Dreaming House. Because if you sleep there, my friend Caleb said with a smirk, it'll show you your worst nightmare. We were sitting around a bonfire at the edge of the woods, the flames crackling against the cool autumn air. That's stupid, I said, tossing another branch into the fire. Is it? Caleb leaned forward, his face lit by the flickering light. You know Mason dared Kyle to spend the night there, right? What happened? Caleb grinned. He lasted about 2 hours before he came running out, screaming about a girl with no face. Everyone laughed, but I felt a chill creep up my spine. When Caleb dared me to spend the night in the Dreaming House, I couldn't back down. It was just a house, I told myself. Old wood, bricks, and creaky floors. The only danger was tetanus. I packed a flashlight, a sleeping bag, and a half-empty bag of chips. At midnight, I stood in front of the house, staring up at its dark windows. The front door was slightly ajar, hanging crookedly on its hinges. Here goes nothing, I muttered, stepping inside. The first thing I noticed was the smell. Damp, like rotting leaves and mildew. The floorboards groaned under my weight as I moved through the dusty rooms. Faded wallpaper peeled from the walls, revealing bare wood underneath. Cobwebs hung in thick drapes from the ceiling. But it was just a house. I set up my sleeping bag in what had once been the living room. The fireplace was empty, its blackened bricks crumbling at the edges. I glanced at my watch. 12:37 a.m. Plenty of time to prove Caleb wrong. The first dream came quickly. I was standing in a long hallway, the walls lined with doors. Each door was slightly open, revealing glimpses of things I couldn't quite make out. A flicker of movement, the glint of an eye, the curve of a hand. I felt something watching me. I turned around, but the hallway stretched endlessly in both directions. And then I saw it, a shadow moving between the doors, too quick to be human. It didn't walk or run, it glided, its movements impossibly smooth. Who's there? I called, my voice echoing. The shadow stopped. It turned toward me and I saw its face, or rather, the absence of one. I woke up gasping, the dream clinging to me like a second skin. The room was cold, colder than it had been before. My breath puffed out in small white clouds, and frost crept along the edges of the windows. Something moved in the corner of the room. I froze, my heart pounding. It was just a shadow, I told myself. Just the flicker of moonlight through the cracked glass. But then it moved again, closer this time. Hello? I whispered. No response. I fumbled for my flashlight, the beam slicing through the darkness. The corner was empty. But the shadow was now by the fireplace. I don't know how I lasted the rest of the night. I sat huddled in my sleeping bag, the flashlight clutched in my hand. Every time I closed my eyes, the dreams came back, different but always the same. The hallway, the doors, the faceless shadow. By dawn I couldn't take it anymore. I grabbed my things and bolted, the house groaning as though it were alive, as though it were laughing at me. When I stepped outside, I felt the sunlight hit my face, warm and reassuring. The world was normal again. Or so I thought. The dreams didn't stop. Every night, I found myself back in that hallway, the shadow always closer, the doors opening wider. Sometimes I saw people in the rooms, people I knew, their faces twisted in terror as they screamed for help. Sometimes I saw myself. And then I stopped dreaming altogether. Instead, the shadow followed me into the waking world. It started small, a flicker in the corner of my eye, a shiver down my spine. But it grew bolder. I'd see it in reflections, standing behind me in mirrors and windows. I'd hear its whispers in the dead of night, soft and low, like the rustle of leaves in the wind. And then I heard it speak. Come back, it said, its voice hollow and distant. Finish what you started. I don't know what the house wants from me. Maybe it dreams through us, feeding on our fears and memories. Maybe it's alive, its wooden beams and crumbling bricks a body, its shadows a soul. Or maybe it's just a house. But every time I see the shadow, I feel its pull. I feel the house calling me, drawing me back to that hallway, to the doors that wait to be opened. One day I know I'll have to go back. Because some houses don't just dream. Some houses hunger. Story 9, the train that never stops. It arrives at midnight no matter where you are. But you better know where you're going, because this train never stops. It was my first night working the graveyard shift at the gas station. The place was a relic from another era, a lone outpost on a desolate stretch of highway. The fluorescent lights buzzed overhead, and the cash register dinged faintly whenever I opened it to count the till. Around 11:45 p.m., the night turned strange. A man walked in. He was tall and thin, wearing a long black coat that seemed too heavy for the mild autumn weather. His face was gaunt, his skin pale as if he hadn't seen sunlight in years. "Good evening," I said, trying to sound friendly. He didn't respond. Instead, he slid a crumpled $5 bill across the counter and pointed at the coffee machine. "Help yourself," I said, handing him a cup. But he didn't move toward the coffee. He just stood there, staring at me with unsettling intensity. "Midnight's coming," he said finally, his voice low and raspy. I frowned. "Yeah, that's usually how time works." "You don't understand," he said, leaning closer. His breath smelled faintly of smoke. "The train is coming." At 11:58 p.m. I heard it. A distant whistle, low and mournful, cutting through the still night air. I stepped outside, my breath catching in my throat. There, in the middle of the empty highway, was a train. Its black locomotive gleamed under the moonlight, steam hissing from its wheels. The cars stretched on forever, vanishing into the darkness. There was no track, no rails, just the endless asphalt of the highway. And yet, the train moved smoothly, its wheels gliding silently over the ground. The man in the black coat appeared beside me. "Where does it go?" I asked, my voice trembling. "Anywhere," he said. "Everywhere." The train slowed to a stop, its doors hissing open. Inside, dim golden light spilled out, casting long shadows on the pavement. "Are you getting on?" the man asked. "Me?" He nodded. "I'm not." "You don't choose the train," he said sharply. "The train chooses you." I don't know what compelled me to step forward, but my feet moved on their own. I climbed the metal steps, my hand gripping the cold railing. The moment I stepped inside, the doors hissed shut behind me. The train lurched forward, picking up speed. The man in the black coat didn't get on. He stayed behind, watching as the train carried me away. The interior of the train was luxurious, like something out of a 1920s film. Velvet seats, crystal chandeliers, and polished brass fixtures. But it was empty. I walked down the aisle, peering into the compartments. Most were unoccupied, but a few held passengers. They didn't look up as I passed. One man was slumped in his seat, staring blankly out the window. His suit was disheveled, and his tie hung loose around his neck. A woman sat across from him, her hands folded neatly in her lap. Her eyes were closed, but her lips moved as if she were whispering something. At the end of the car, a small boy sat alone, clutching a teddy bear. I stopped. "Hey," I said softly. "Are you okay?" He looked up at me, his eyes wide and frightened. "Don't go to the dining car," he whispered. Before I could ask what he meant, the train shook violently and I stumbled against the wall. A voice crackled over the intercom, low and distorted. "Next stop, where you belong." I shivered. The hallway stretched endlessly before me, the golden light flickering overhead. Doors lined both sides, some slightly ajar. I could hear faint sounds from within, laughter, sobbing, music. I opened one. Inside was my childhood bedroom, exactly as I remembered it. The glow-in-the-dark stars on the ceiling, the stack of comic books on the nightstand, the scratch on the wall where I'd once thrown a toy in a tantrum. It was impossible. I stepped inside and the air changed. Felt heavy, like the room was pressing down on me. A voice whispered in my ear. "Stay." I bolted back into the hallway, slamming the door shut behind me. The train groaned, its wheels screeching as it took a sharp turn. The boy's warning echoed in my mind. "Don't go to the dining car." But the train seemed to be guiding me there, its golden lights growing dimmer until only one path remained. The dining car was unlike the rest of the train. It was dark and cold, the walls lined with black glass. The tables were set with fine china, but the plates were empty. And the passengers, they were shadows. Vague, flickering shapes that shifted and writhed as they sat at the tables. At the far end of the car, a conductor stood, his face obscured by a hat. "Where am I?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. He didn't answer. Instead, he pointed to a seat. My name was engraved on the placard in front of it. I sat down, my heart pounding. The conductor placed a silver platter in front of me, lifting the lid with a flourish. There was no food. Instead, the platter held a single photograph. It was me. Not a picture of me, but me. I was sitting at this very table, staring down at the photo in my hands. And then I realized, the shadows at the other tables weren't strangers. They were me too. The intercom crackled again. Final stop, the truth? The train screeched to a halt and the lights went out. When they came back on, I was standing in the gas station again, the register dinging faintly behind me. The man in the black coat was gone. But in the distance I could still hear the whistle of the train. And I knew it wasn't over. Because once you board the train that never stops, you're always a passenger. Story 10, The House with No Corners. It's easy to find. It's the house where no one's shadow stays still. It started with a dare, as these things often do. Bet you won't go inside, Logan said, his grin daring me to argue. We stood at the edge of the woods, staring at the infamous house. It looked abandoned, its paint faded and peeling, windows dusty and opaque. But the strangest thing about the house wasn't its state of decay. It was the fact that no matter how you looked at it, there wasn't a single corner in the architecture. Every edge was curved, every joint rounded. Even the roof sloped in soft, unnatural waves. You guys are idiots, Amanda said, hugging her jacket closer. There's a reason no one goes near that place. Oh, come on, Logan said. You don't actually believe the stories, do you? I don't know, she muttered. But people say once you go in you can't trust your own shadow. I wasn't sure why I agreed to it. Maybe I wanted to prove I wasn't scared. Maybe I just wanted to wipe that smug grin off Logan's face. But as soon as I stepped inside, I knew I'd made a mistake. The air was thick, almost syrupy, and the light didn't behave the way it should. It filtered in through the cracked windows, but instead of spreading evenly, it pooled in strange shapes on the floor. And the shadows. They moved. At first, I thought it was just my imagination. I stepped into the living room, my sneakers crunching on the dusty floor. My shadow stretched long and thin in front of me, cast by the weak sunlight filtering through the glass. But then it shifted. I hadn't moved. And yet my shadow did. It jerked to the left, then to the right, as if it were testing the boundaries of its tether to me. Very funny, Logan, I called out, my voice echoing in the empty house. But he didn't answer. I glanced over my shoulder, expecting to see him grinning in the doorway. Instead, the doorway was empty. And so was the yard beyond it. The house felt alive. Every step I took echoed back at me, but not in the way it should have. The echoes were offbeat, delayed, as if the house was deciding whether to mimic me or not. The curved walls made the place feel disorienting. Without corners, I couldn't tell where rooms ended or began. I turned into what I thought was a hallway, but the walls curled back on themselves, leading me in a circle. That's when I noticed the second shadow. It wasn't mine. It was shorter, stubbier, its shape unfamiliar. It stood beside me, wavering slightly like heat rising off asphalt. And then it moved. It darted down the hall, vanishing around a curved wall. Logan? I called, though my voice cracked. No answer. I hesitated, my feet rooted to the floor. I didn't want to follow it, but the house seemed to push me forward, the curved walls funneling me deeper inside. The next room was worse. The furniture was warped, its edges rounded like the house itself. A table sat in the center, its legs twisted into spirals. A mirror hung on the wall, its frame an unbroken oval. But the worst part was my shadow. It wasn't mine anymore. It had stretched taller, thinner, its limbs elongated and spindly. And it wasn't attached to me. The shadow moved on its own, pacing the floor like an impatient animal. I backed away, my heart pounding, but the shadow didn't follow. Instead, it pointed. Its long, crooked fingers stretched toward the mirror. I didn't want to look. But something compelled me. The mirror's surface rippled, as though it were made of water. And in its depths I saw something impossible, myself. But it wasn't a reflection. It was me trapped on the other side, pounding on the glass, my face twisted in terror. Help me, the other me screamed, though no sound came through. Behind the mirror, the house twisted and writhed, its walls shifting like the coils of a snake. And then I saw them. Shadows. Dozens of them, flitting through the warped corridors, their shapes wrong and broken. They weren't shadows of people. They were shadows of the house itself. I stumbled back, my breath coming in gasps. Logan. I screamed, though I knew he couldn't hear me. The house groaned, its walls shuddering. The mirror began to crack, thin lines spidering across its surface. And then I realized, it wasn't cracking. It was opening. The other me reached through, its fingers curling around the edges of the mirror. Don't let it take you, Amanda's voice echoed in my mind, though I hadn't seen her since we'd entered the house. The thing that looked like me smiled, its teeth too sharp, too white. "I've been waiting for you," it said. I ran. The house seemed to shift around me, its curved walls folding and unfolding like an endless maze. Everywhere I turned, there were shadows. Shadows of chairs, of doors, of things that didn't exist outside the house. And then I saw the door. It was open, golden light spilling out onto the floor. I sprinted toward it, my legs burning, my lungs screaming for air. Behind me, I could hear the shadows closing in, their whispers growing louder, more insistent. I burst through the door and collapsed onto the grass. The cool night air filled my lungs, and for a moment I just lay there, staring up at the stars. But when I looked back at the house, it was gone. The woods were silent, the clearing empty. And then I saw it. My shadow. It wasn't mine anymore. It lingered a moment longer, standing upright on the grass. And then it turned and walked back into the woods. Hey everyone. If you're loving the stories, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe to the channel. Your support helps us keep the spooky tales coming. Hit that bell icon so you don't miss the next chilling adventure. Let's keep the chills alive. Thank you.